All right, continuing our chapter 12 little lecture here, let's talk about the president's cabinet. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it establish a cabinet or a system of executive advisors to the president, but it doesn't say they can't do it either. And so the tradition of the cabinet goes all the way back to George Washington. The cabinet is made up of heads of department of the executive branch. For example, like the head of the Office of Management and Budget is a part of the cabinet. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, that's another one that certainly wasn't around during the time of George Washington. In fact, today there are 15 departments represented in the president's cabinet. It's an advisory body, but in practice, it's probably too large to be as effective as it should be. Members have a limited area of expertise. For example, the Secretary of Transportation deals with transportation. Secretary of Labor deals with labor and workforce type things. For example, and these folks are not necessarily chosen for their ability to work with the president. There have been members of the cabinets that have not worked well with presidents at all. Others have been much better. As a matter of fact, from time to time, a president may actually ask for the resignation of a member of his cabinet, and members of the cabinet are approved by the Senate as a part of the checks and balances there. This is Ash Carter. Ash Carter was Secretary of Defense during the last 2 years of the President Obama's administration, possibly a little bit longer than that. But here he is meeting the troops, possibly in Afghanistan. Would be my thought. All right, let's talk a little bit about presidential character. Character matters in the fact that the voters are going to look at who the president is and how they behave, how they speak to the public, and just what kind of presence do they have. Leadership, integrity, and competence are all key things that voters look for when choosing a president. And since the president is at the forefront of national politics, scandals oftentimes make big news. Nixon in the 1970s, you had Nixon with Watergate, which hopefully you know a little bit about from your U.S. history classes. The Clinton Monica Lewinsky scandal in 1996, 1997 or so. I don't remember the year exactly, but that was a big news during President Clinton's administration. And of course, there have been some scandals since then for various presidents, and it just seems like at least every presidential administration there's some kind of a scandal that comes along. All right, so take a look at this interesting little rating. On the left-hand side, you've got Gallup poll ratings. They've put the word out to the American people and said, hey, who do you think is the greatest president of all time? And it ticks it all the way down to number 12. And then when historians are asked, you'll notice that they're not the same. Some presidents on the historians list don't even make the Gallup ratings. Some on the Gallup ratings don't make the historians list. One thing that I found interesting is most of the ones in the Gallup ratings are individuals that were either around during the lifetime of modern Americans or maybe their parents' or their grandparents' lifetimes. Historians tend to throw the ratings much farther back in time, with James K. Polk or let's see, Thomas Jefferson, for example. All right, now the president's chief power. This was something called the bully pulpit by Theodore Roosevelt. This is the power of a president to persuade. Presidents must have interpersonal and practical political skills. They must be able to communicate a message and in many ways work with others to get that message done into practical application. Presidents must depend on others' cooperation. This cooperation oftentimes is with the Congress, either the Senate or the House. They use their personality and prestige to forge agreements among the factions. And factions may be more than just political parties. Sometimes it's caucuses. We call them caucuses, little groups within the Congress itself. Ted Cruz, I heard him say the other day, he sort of jokingly said he was a part of the cowboy boot faction, a group of members of the Senate and the Congress that wear cowboy boots to work. So, I mean, as simple as that. Possible. There's a Republican women faction. There was a Tea Party caucus at one point. The influence is related to professional reputation and prestige. So, in other words, when we start to see things like scandals, sometimes that prestige, that personal reputation, might take a bit of a hit. And opposing legislators may work to make the president look bad, and we've seen that quite a bit here recently. All right, now the president. Let's talk about the president and the public. Now, one tool that the president has is called going public. Going public means you approach the American people directly with your vision, and you're not necessarily relying upon decisions made by Congress. Franklin Roosevelt did this with his fireside chats. I would say that President Trump has been doing that with his Twitter blasts that he does. The idea of going public is just simply a way for the president to reach out directly to you and I. The president and his staff monitor public opinion polls. Right now, I can guarantee you that presidential administration figures are looking at the polls. When the poll's running high, they judge that as being they're doing something that the people favor. When they are low, then maybe the people don't favor it, and sometimes there's an adjustment in direction. Every president has what is called a honeymoon period. It's a period of time when they're settling in, they're riding high off of an election usually, and it almost seems like the president can do no wrong. This sometimes lasts a few months, sometimes it lasts a few years, but eventually it does wear off, and when that happens, we do start to see the presidential opinion polling going down. Economic conditions are going to have a tremendous amount of impact on this rating. When the economy is doing very well and people are working, the presidents tend to get pretty high marks. When the economy is poor and a lot of folks are out of work, presidents tend to see a negative impact upon their rating. The president's main concern with public opinion can be defended as a means of furthering what we call majoritarian democracy. Remember, that's the majority of the people. How do the majority of the people feel about the job that this individual president is doing? I'll let you guys check out the chart here on your own. Now, dealing with the president in relation to Congress, the greatest success that a president has with Congress typically is immediately after inauguration. The president's popularity is usually at its peak at that point, at least it's very high, and Congress wants to get in good with the new president. They want to appear to be working together. Success is often measured by how often a president wins what are called roll call votes. Roll call vote means there's not a specific counting of the votes. When it's very closely divided, all in favor say yay, yay, and all in favor say nay, nay, and you can't tell who wins it. It involves a vote that gets counted. Roll call. That's kind of what a roll call vote is. A roll call vote is when you can't tell who wins, and so a person is putting their name to it, for example. In times of divided government, when the president is of one party and Congress is of another, or one house of Congress is of one party, and so on and so forth, this is divided government. And when not much gets done, this is something referred to as gridlock. Dealing with elections, presidents these are the only elected official charged with representing all of the people. Governors represent all of a state, but the president represents all of the people of the nation, regardless of party. Candidates try to win votes from different groups through stand-on issues. For example, gun rights or pro-choice, pro-life might be an issue, or immigration might be an issue. And so candidates try to connect with the people through these issues. Presidents make majoritarian interpretation of the electoral process, which means they're trying to get as much of a majority of the people to side with them as possible. And debates do in fact matter. So here's one from 2016. All right. Presidential leadership is determined in part by several things. Whether a president is a member of a dominant party, Republican or Democrat. I don't know of a president that's ever not been a part of one of the two dominant parties. Rather, public policies and political philosophy associated with this party have widespread support. For example, like the conservative, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Think about what those parties stand for. Do the majority of people in the nation support those? It's pretty evenly divided right now. Greater opportunity. There's also, in part, by a greater opportunity to change public policy when he or she is in the majority, and opposing party is perceived as unable to solve the major national problems. Challenger parties almost always do this. They try to make it look like the president in power cannot fix the problems at hand, and they try to make a good case that they can, while the sitting president maybe cannot. Presidents differ greatly in their views of the role of government. Different presidents view it differently. President Johnson in the 1960s, viewed that government had a responsibility to help the disadvantaged, and he does so with the Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and that sort of a thing. President Reagan in the 1980s is going to emphasize freedom. He did not acknowledge justice or equality. His is more about the rule of law. And in fact, he was somewhat suspicious of government. At least that was the rhetoric that he used. And that was Reagan. And he sort of is looked upon as sort of a groundbreaker president of the modern conservative movement. The political agenda that a president has, these roots are founded in political ideology of the president. How does he feel about those big issues in the nation? President's legislative leadership in the 20th century has become sort of a phenomenon. What does that mean? Well, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, presidents have had increasingly more and more and more power, to where in many ways they overshadow the Congress, which was supposed to have been the most powerful branch of government. Then there's Johnson here, and there's Reagan here. So two very different presidents. The president is the chief lobbyist, which means, remember, a lobbyist is someone that goes before lawmakers and sort of asks for things, puts their opinion forth, tries to shape the legislative process. The president does that for the executive branch, or those members of his staff, like liaisons within his staff, that go to Congress and represent the president. So this is increasingly happens more and more. That's pretty much been the case since Woodrow Wilson, 1912, 1916, 1918. He's the party leader, this is an informal duty of the president. This has come about as a result of the fact that we have political parties. Presidents and congressional leaders may often have various different viewpoints. Sometimes they are able to come to an agreement, sometimes not. And presidents oftentimes focus more on party leadership than bridging differences between the parties themselves. So they work with individual members of Congress rather than trying to find common ground on the issues quite often. The president is also the fundraiser in chief for the party, and he also has certain tools at his disposal, like Air Force One. The president has also a significant role in foreign relations. Since the end of World War II, and certainly until the late 1900s, presidents like Reagan, Kennedy, and others have played a tremendous role in dealing with foreign nations. Personally, presidents have been preoccupied with the expansion of communism, for example, until the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union kind of collapsed. So hopefully you got that far in your history classes. Today's presidents typically have three objectives: dealing with national security issues, fostering peaceful international environments, in other words, we avoid war where we can, and protecting U.S. economic interests. That sometimes does involve war, but dealing with the money and dealing with trade and trade negotiations and treaties and that sort of a thing. Now, there's some places where the Constitution is somewhat ambiguous. The Constitution gives power to the legislative branch to declare war, to set money aside. But militarily, the presidency is also commander-in-chief. Foreign policy is squarely within the hands of the president. The Constitution also leaves some things unsaid. There's some places where the executive and legislative branches overlap. Checks and balance is sort of an obscure deal there that can be argued from time to time, and the War Powers Act remains very controversial, especially since the passage of the War Powers Act. All right, there's a little bit more about the War Powers Resolution, the Senate's treaty power. Look at the executive agreement like NAFTA. NAFTA just went away here recently. And I may actually just spend about 5 more minutes or so trying to hit these last points. We'll see what I can put together. You guys take care. Hopefully this finds you well. Bye-bye.